Picture this. It is August 17th, 1424, and a lone rider gallops full speed into the English camp under a white flag. He does not bring terms of surrender, he brings a death warrant. The message from the massive Franco-Scottish coalition is blunt. There will be no ransoms today. No prisoners taken. Every man who falls will be slaughtered on the spot. In an era where capturing wealthy knights alive is the whole point of war, this is a shocking violation of the chivalric code. For the 9,000 English soldiers staring down an advancing wall of 15,000 enemies, the reality is instantly terrifying. They are trapped deep in enemy territory, out of food, and completely cut off from retreat. If they lose, they will be butchered to the last man. How does an exhausted, isolated force turn a guaranteed massacre into one of the most brutal underdog victories at the Battle of Verneuil, 1424? Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The Duke of Bedford has no time for panic. He orders his men to dig in right where they stand on the baked, rock-hard dirt of the French plains. He knows he is completely outmatched in numbers and heavy cavalry. The Scottish infantry opposite them are not here for politics. The fearsome Douglas clan has crossed the Channel for one reason: pure, bloody revenge against the English. They lock their massive pikes together, forming an impenetrable steel wall that begins marching relentlessly forward. Meanwhile, on the flanks, Bedford watches hundreds of elite Milanese mercenary cavalry preparing to charge. They are clad in impenetrable plate armour, making the legendary English longbows practically useless. Standard tactics will get them all killed. The English supply carts are quickly circled into a makeshift fort at the rear, not to protect gold, but to prevent a total rout. Bedford realises that the brutal no quarter order just handed him his only tactical advantage. His soldiers know they are dead men walking. Fear transforms into cold-blooded aggression. The English archers abandon their standard skirmish lines, driving their defensive wooden stakes into the hard ground with frantic speed. They draw their weapons not to win glory or capture nobles. They are preparing to fight with the absolute savagery of cornered animals. How exactly did a bankrupt prince afford the most fearsome mercenary army in Europe? By the summer of 1424, the French Dauphin, Charles VII, possessed almost zero financial credibility. The English controlled Paris and the wealthy northern territories, leaving Charles isolated in the south. His enemies mockingly called him the King of Bourges. His treasury held dust. Yet, looking across the Verneuil battlefield, the Duke of Bedford faced thousands of elite Scottish veterans alongside heavily armoured Milanese cavalry. Wars require cold, hard cash, especially when paying foreigners to bleed for your crown. Charles managed this impossible feat by selling pieces of France itself. To secure the massive Scottish army, the Dauphin mortgaged his kingdom's prestige. He granted Archibald, the Earl of Douglas, the title of Duke of Touraine. Giving a foreign warlord one of the wealthiest duchies in the realm shocked the French court. Charles also handed over the legendary castle of Chinon and vast surrounding estates, just to keep those Scottish pikes pointed toward the English. The French nobility absolutely despised the Scots, viewing them as uncultured thugs who drank too much and respected nobody. Desperation forced their hand. Charles knew his royal survival depended entirely on Scottish muscle. Equipping the army created another logistical nightmare. Charles hired hundreds of elite cavalry from Milan, men completely encased in the finest, most expensive steel armour available in the 15th century. Securing these mercenaries drained whatever silver reserves remained. Moving and feeding 15,000 soldiers, plus thousands of war horses across a pillaged, war-torn countryside, required ruthless extraction. Chroniclers like Thomas Basin detail the devastating economic toll on the local French peasantry. Royal tax collectors stripped villages bare of grain and livestock to feed this marching coalition. Every wagon of wheat and every barrel of wine funneled toward this single, decisive confrontation. Charles bet every remaining ounce of his political and economic capital on this specific army. This high-stakes financial gamble aimed to deliver one of the most devastating 100 Years' War brutal battles. The Dauphin pushed all his chips to the centre of the table. A victory would reclaim northern France. A defeat at Verneuil meant total financial collapse and the permanent loss of the French crown. John of Lancaster, the Duke of Bedford, lacked the romantic flair of his late brother, King Henry V. He approached war like a ruthless mathematician. While Henry relied on the muddy, constricted funnel of Agincourt to drown French knights, Bedford chose the exact opposite environment for Verneuil. He marched his 9,000 men onto a wide, flat, sun-baked plain in the absolute peak of August heat. This seemingly suicidal placement against a numerically superior enemy was entirely deliberate. The English commander understood exactly what he was facing. Milanese heavy cavalry rode at the forefront of the French lines, wearing steel plate so advanced it could shrug off standard longbow arrows from a distance. Milanese armourers forged their suits with rounded, glancing surfaces specifically designed to deflect projectiles. Bedford needed hard earth, not soft mud, to anchor his only defence against this impenetrable steel. Upon his command, English archers began driving thousands of double-pointed wooden stakes deep into the rock-hard dirt. Doing this in 30°C heat while wearing heavy padded armour drained the men's remaining strength. They angled the sharpened timber outward, creating a lethal, bristling wall meant to impale charging warhorses. He then arranged his forces into two main divisions, anchoring the vulnerable flanks with his archers. The true brilliance of Bedford's tactical calculus lay hidden behind the main lines. Recognizing that the Milanese cavalry might actually punch through his wooden barricade, he prepared a lethal contingency. A massive circle of supply wagons was lashed together at the rear to protect the remaining horses and non-combatants. This makeshift wagon fort concealed a deadly secret. Bedford stationed a hand-picked reserve force of elite longbowmen inside this baggage train, keeping them completely out of the enemy's line of sight. The afternoon heat intensified, baking the English soldiers inside their iron helmets. Water supplies had vanished hours ago. Thirst gnawed at the men as they stood in deafening silence, waiting for the onslaught. Across the shimmering dusty plain, 15,000 Franco-Scottish soldiers began to beat their weapons against their shields. The ground started to vibrate under the hooves of the Italian mercenaries. Bedford had laid his trap, deliberately placing his entire army on the razor's edge of total destruction. The English archers drew their hemp bowstrings back to their ears, unleashing a synchronized volley that darkened the blinding August sky. Thousands of steel-tipped bodkin arrows rained down on the advancing Milanese cavalry. 9 years earlier, at Agincourt, a similar volley turned French knights into pincushions. The outcome at Verneuil shattered English confidence in a matter of seconds. The arrows struck the Italian mercenaries and simply bounced off, filling the air with the deafening clatter of steel pinging against steel. Milanese armourers in the 1420s produced the absolute pinnacle of metallurgical technology. They forged heat-treated steel plates with rounded, asymmetrical surfaces designed specifically to deflect kinetic energy. An English longbow possessed a draw weight of up to 150 pounds, firing a projectile capable of piercing standard wrought iron. Against the tempered steel forged in Milan, these armour-piercing arrows were effectively useless. The Burgundian chronicler Jean de Wavrin, a man intimately familiar with 15th century warfare, recorded the terrifying reality of this exact moment. The Milanese riders tucked their heads, protected their horses' vulnerable faces with steel plating, and rode straight through the lethal storm without losing a single man to arrow fire. Panic ripped through the English defensive lines. Their ultimate weapon, the very foundation of their military supremacy, had failed completely. The thundering mass of armoured war horses smashed into the hastily erected barricade of sharpened wooden stakes. The impact sounded like an explosion. Wood splintered and snapped under the weight of the war horses. The sheer momentum of the heavy cavalry charge tore a massive hole straight through the right wing of the English formation. Hundreds of lightly armoured archers were trampled into the dust, their bodies crushed beneath thousands of pounds of galloping muscle and iron. Mainstream military history often portrays the English longbowman as an invincible force of the Middle Ages. The slaughter on the right flank at Verneuil reveals a much darker tactical reality. The Duke of Bedford understood the technological limitations of his archers against top-tier Italian armour. Placing them on the flanks was a calculated, cold-blooded sacrifice. Those men were deployed as human shock absorbers. Their bodies, their wooden stakes and their lives were spent to bleed off the kinetic energy of the Milanese charge. Bedford fed his own legendary archers to the meat grinder, deliberately sacrificing his right wing just to prevent the heavy cavalry from crashing directly into his core infantry in the centre. The right flank of the English army collapsed in a mess of splintered wood and shattered bone. Milanese mercenaries smashed through the protective stakes, riding straight over the archers and barrelling toward the rear baggage train. Thousands of heavy iron horseshoes tore into the drought-stricken earth, kicking up a blinding storm of pulverized dirt. Weeks without rain had turned the plains of Verneuil into a dry bowl of loose topsoil, and this specific environmental factor fundamentally altered the course of the battle. Across the field, the Franco-Scottish commanders strained their eyes against the thick, choking haze. Visibility dropped to near zero. They could not hear the desperate screams or the localized clash of steel over the deafening, continuous rumble of galloping horses. To the French nobility and the Scottish warlords, that massive dust cloud moving rapidly toward the English rear signalled exactly what they wanted to believe. The English lines were breaking. The hated invaders were finally turning tail and running. Military discipline evaporated in a heartbeat. The carefully coordinated battle plan, drawn up over days by the French and Scottish generals, vanished in a surge of collective adrenaline and sheer greed. French men-at-arms desperately wanted the glory of running down fleeing Englishmen. They abandoned their defensive positions and lunged forward without waiting for orders. The Scottish pikemen, driven by their deep-seated blood feud and the early morning no-quarter pact, joined the chaotic advance. The Earl of Douglas frantically tried to hold his lines, but the momentum of thousands of vengeful men proved impossible to stop. A disorganized mass of infantry began sprinting across the sun-baked field. The ambient temperature hovered around 30 degrees Celsius that afternoon. Running across uneven, rock-hard ground in 50 pounds of steel plate and chainmail under a blazing August sun creates a physiological nightmare. Heat exhaustion sets in within minutes. Men literally began to bake inside their own iron helmets. By the time the Franco-Scottish vanguard closed the long distance, their soldiers were gasping for oxygen. Sweat blinded them inside their enclosed visors. Their impenetrable, tightly packed pike formations fractured into a scattered, exhausted, heaving mob. John of Lancaster watched this suicidal charge from the centre of the English line. His core infantry, comprised of battle-hardened veterans wielding heavy poleaxes and shortened lances, remained absolutely silent and disciplined. The Duke had never ordered a retreat. He simply allowed the enemy to deceive themselves. The dust cloud wasn't an English rout. It was a Milanese looting spree. As the exhausted Franco-Scottish infantry finally stumbled out of the haze, panting and entirely disorganized, the horrific reality of their mistake set in. The English centre had not moved a single inch. They stood waiting in tight formation, weapons raised, ready to slaughter the exhausted men staggering blindly into their trap. The Franco-Scottish vanguard slammed into the English centre with a deafening crash of timber and steel. Thousands of exhausted men collided with the fresh, disciplined ranks of the Duke of Bedford's dismounted men-at-arms. The Earl of Douglas pushed his Scottish pikemen forward, desperate to break the English lines through sheer numerical superiority. The physical reality of their frantic charge across the sun-baked plain instantly caught up with them. Biology dictated the slaughter. The Scottish soldiers were severely dehydrated and gasping for oxygen inside their enclosed helmets. The English had simply stood still for hours, preserving their calories and stamina. This massive difference in energy reserves turned a battle into a butchery. English men-at-arms wielded poleaxes, devastating weapons featuring a heavy axe blade on one side and a spiked hammer on the other. They functioned essentially as medieval can openers against plate armour. The fresh English soldiers systematically dismantled the exhausted Scottish front line. They hooked the long pikes aside and drove their steel spikes into the weak points of the enemy's armour, targeting armpits, groins and eye slits. Jean de Wevrin stood shoulder to shoulder with the English infantry that afternoon. He later recorded that the ferocity of the hand-to-hand combat surpassed anything he had ever experienced in his lifetime. The pressure of thousands of men pushing forward from the Franco-Scottish rear trapped the frontline soldiers in a suffocating crush. Men died on their feet, their ribs crushed by the immense weight of the crowd, completely unable to swing their weapons or even fall to the ground. The dry August dirt quickly turned into a slick, red paste under their armoured boots. Meanwhile, a grim resurrection occurred on the ruined right flank. The English archers who survived the initial trampling by the Milanese cavalry began pulling themselves out of the dust. Their longbows were snapped, and their defensive stakes lay in splinters. Standard military logic dictated they should flee the battlefield to save themselves. These men chose a radically different path. Armed only with lead mauls, armour-piercing daggers and pure adrenaline, these lightly armoured survivors sprinted toward the exposed flanks of the Franco-Scottish infantry. They threw themselves directly into the massive melee. Without heavy steel plates weighing them down, they moved rapidly through the chaotic crush, slipping under the long pikes to stab upward into the unprotected joints of the Scottish knights. The heavy infantry who thought they had destroyed the English archers were now being dismantled by the very men they had trampled. The Milanese heavy cavalry possessed the power to end the Battle of Verneuil within the first hour. After shattering the English right wing, hundreds of armoured Italians found themselves deep in the English rear, completely unopposed. A basic tactical manoeuvre, wheeling around to strike the engaged English infantry from behind, would have crushed John of Lancaster's army instantly. The anvil was set, but the hammer refused to fall. 15th century mercenary economics hijacked the Franco-Scottish battle plan. These elite cavalrymen fought for cold, hard florins, not for the Dauphin's political ambitions. Under standard mercenary contracts of the era, soldiers kept the plunder they physically secured during combat. When the Italian riders spotted the sprawling English baggage train, military discipline evaporated. That circle of wagons represented a floating treasury holding the accumulated wealth, spare armour, and personal coin purses of the entire English expeditionary force. The Milanese broke formation entirely. They swarmed the carts, eager to stuff their saddlebags before the main battle concluded. Their sheer greed granted the English a miraculous reprieve. The Duke of Bedford had anticipated this exact psychological flaw. He understood that men fighting for pay invariably prioritize immediate loot over strategic victory. Bedford had secretly stationed a reserve force of his most experienced longbowmen inside that ring of supply wagons. He kept them hidden, holding their fire even as their comrades on the right flank were trampled to death. As the Italian mercenaries slowed down, broke ranks, and began ransacking the carts in the blistering August heat, the Duke's trap sprang shut. The reserve archers emerged from behind the wooden carts at point-blank range. At 20 yards, even the finest Milanese plate armour had fatal vulnerabilities. The English bowmen bypassed the impenetrable breastplates entirely. They unleashed a devastating volley aimed directly at the unarmoured underbellies of the war horses and the exposed throats of the riders. Many mercenaries had lifted their heavy visors to breathe in the sweltering 30-degree heat while looting. That momentary comfort proved fatal. The baggage train instantly transformed from a treasure trove into a bloodbath. Massive war horses shrieked and collapsed, pinning their heavily armoured riders beneath hundreds of pounds of dying muscle. Stranded on foot inside a maze of overturned wagons, the surviving Milanese knights found themselves trapped in a close-quarters nightmare. Plundering requires mobility and intimidation. Facing a relentless barrage of arrows from enraged Englishmen, the mercenaries rapidly recalculated their profit margins. The battle was no longer lucrative, it was a death trap. The surviving Italians abandoned their stolen goods, spurred their remaining horses, and fled the battlefield entirely. The most technologically advanced cavalry force in Europe simply rode away to save themselves, leaving their Scottish and French allies completely abandoned in the centre of the field. The deafening roar of the initial charge slowly died out, replaced by a much more terrifying reality for the Franco-Scottish vanguard. The Scottish pikemen, locked in a suffocating push against the English centre, expected the Milanese cavalry to crash into the English rear at any moment. That hammer blow never arrived. A horrifying realization rippled through the tightly packed ranks of the Douglas clan. Looking over their shoulders through the dust, they saw fleeing mercenaries, not reinforcements. They were completely alone. The elite Italian riders had taken the gold and abandoned the field, leaving thousands of infantrymen trapped in a lethal meat grinder. Bedford's strategy snapped perfectly into place. The fresh English men-at-arms pressed their advantage against the exhausted, dehydrated Scots. The massive 18-foot pikes that made the Scottish formation so fearsome suddenly became a fatal liability. Once the English stepped inside the reach of those long wooden shafts, the pikes were utterly useless. Scottish soldiers dropped their primary weapons and drew short swords, but the press of bodies was simply too tight. The crush of men pushing from behind meant the soldiers in the front literally could not raise their arms to defend themselves. Meanwhile, the surviving English archers swarmed the exposed flanks like angry hornets, using heavy lead mauls to cave in helmets and shatter kneecaps. Archibald, the Earl of Douglas, fought in the centre of this collapsing nightmare. Just days earlier, the French Dauphin had crowned him the Duke of Touraine, handing him vast estates and unimaginable wealth. He possessed a fortune worth capturing. In any other medieval battle, an English knight would have happily taken him alive, securing a ransom that could build a castle back in Yorkshire. The arrogant decree delivered that morning changed everything. The Scottish demand for a battle with no quarter now sealed their own doom. The English soldiers, pushed to the absolute brink of physical and mental exhaustion, offered exactly what was requested. Zero mercy. Archibald Douglas fell into the blood-soaked dirt, his skull crushed by men who did not care about his brand-new French titles or his gold. With their commander dead, the Scottish lines disintegrated. Panic infected the remaining French infantry, turning the battle into a desperate foot race away from the slaughter. The English did not stop to take prisoners. They hunted down the fleeing soldiers across the baked plains of Verneuil, butchering them relentlessly until the sun finally set. The military elite of Scotland was practically wiped from existence in a single afternoon, their bodies left to rot under the blazing August sky. Silence fell over the plains of Verneuil as the August sun dipped below the horizon. The dry earth had soaked up an unimaginable amount of blood. Over 6,000 soldiers belonging to the Franco-Scottish coalition lay dead, with the vast majority being Scottish infantrymen. The Duke of Bedford now faced the gruesome logistics of a medieval aftermath. His own men were severely dehydrated and battered, yet their immediate task involved stripping thousands of corpses of valuable steel armour and weapons. Leaving tempered metal to rust was an economic crime, especially for a mercenary army expecting bonuses. Furthermore, the intense heat of late summer meant bodies would bloat and spread disease within hours. English soldiers forced local French peasants to dig massive trench graves in the rock-hard soil, unceremoniously dumping the Scottish elite into nameless pits. The leadership of the Scottish Expeditionary Force essentially evaporated in a single afternoon. Archibald Douglas, the newly minted Duke of Touraine, perished alongside his son James and his son-in-law, the Earl of Buchan. This represented a catastrophic demographic blow to the Kingdom of Scotland. A whole generation of military nobility crossed the sea to fight for foreign gold and died far from home. The Old Alliance, the historical military pact between France and Scotland, had always demanded a heavy price in blood. Verneuil, however, was absolute annihilation. Never again would a Scottish army of this magnitude deploy on the European continent. Word of the massacre reached Charles VII at his court in Bourges several days later. The Dauphin received the news with absolute paralysing horror. He had mortgaged the remaining wealth of his fractured kingdom to hire those Scottish pikes and Milanese lances. He had alienated his own nobility by handing precious French lands to foreign warlords just to keep them fighting. Now, his royal treasury held nothing, and his final, most expensive army was rotting in the dirt. The financial ruin was absolute. Charles had zero funds left to raise another defence. The road to the southern heartland of France lay completely exposed. The Duke of Bedford had systematically shattered the last organised resistance capable of stopping the English conquest. For the Dauphin, the crown of France seemed permanently lost. He fell into a deep depression, convinced that God had abandoned his lineage entirely. Complete English dominance over the European continent was no longer just a threat. It was an unavoidable, imminent reality. The massacre at Verneuil shattered the military backbone of Scotland and left the French crown completely bankrupt. By any logical military metric, August 17, 1424, stands as the definitive turning point of the 100 Years' War. It was far bloodier, tactically more complex, and strategically more devastating than Agincourt. Shakespeare immortalised King Henry V's muddy victory 9 years earlier, turning it into a legendary triumph of the English underdog. Verneuil, meanwhile, faded into deep historical obscurity. Mainstream culture completely forgot about the sun-baked plains where 9,000 desperate Englishmen annihilated 15,000 heavily armoured Franco-Scottish soldiers. The reason for this collective amnesia lies in the sheer unpredictability of history. John of Lancaster, the Duke of Bedford, had secured total dominance over the continent. The Dauphin, Charles VII, was trapped in Bourges, entirely stripped of his wealth, his armies, and his political allies. The English conquest of France seemed absolute. The systematic destruction of the Milanese mercenaries and the Scottish elite infantry left an undeniable power vacuum. Nobody in Europe believed the French monarchy could survive another decade. 5 years after the slaughter at Verneuil, an illiterate teenage farm girl walked into the Dauphin's court. Joan of Arc's sudden appearance completely hijacked the historical narrative. Her miraculous victories and subsequent martyrdom provided a perfect, divine origin story for the reborn French nation. The terrifying reality of Verneuil, a battle lost entirely due to mercenary greed, physical exhaustion, and the cold-blooded calculus of a brilliant English tactician, simply failed to fit the romanticised myth of France's spiritual resurrection. The Scottish blood, soaking the dirt of Normandy, became an inconvenient footnote. History rarely remembers the annihilations that happen right before a miracle. The Battle of Verneuil forces us to confront the terrifying reality of medieval combat. Wars hinge on raw, brutal mathematics. Victory belongs to the army that preserves its water supply, and defeat falls upon commanders who trust greedy mercenaries to hold a defensive line. It strips away the romance of chivalry and leaves only the primal desperation of survival. Thank you for joining me as we uncover the brutal reality of the Battle of Verneuil. If this forgotten slaughter changed how you view the 100 Years' War, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe. What historical battle do you think deserves more attention? Let me know in the comments below, and I will see you in the next video.